We got the go live. All right. The amateur hour begins. And we are live.
Background.
Awesome. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to Your Bytes, Your Rights, a weekly live discussion and podcast about data ownership, digital rights, and your privacy. I'm 𝗀𝗃𝗃 of Privacy Plan. This week, we are discussing facial recognition and facial authentication. How safe is it? I'm here with my co-host, 𝗀𝗁𝗵𝗃, managing partner at 𝗪𝗂𝗍 Capital, a VC fund that focuses on blockchain tech. Sorry, dropped that ball. Chris is a privacy advocate and has a big interest in identity solutions and the future of money. Say hello, Chris.
Hey. Actually, I was just driving back from Los Angeles and I was listening to a bunch of different podcasts on the topic on fast play. But the most interesting thing I learned is that there's apparently toilets in China with facial recognition that allow you to only withdraw a certain amount of toilet paper. Another interesting clue to this is we made an investment in a biometric company called FaceTech, and I was just bought a few months ago by a company called 𝗀𝗃. But I have a lot of thoughts on these topics, as you know.
You talking about FaceTech or Keyless or
Keyless? Yeah. What did I say?
I don't remember getting purchased. So thanks for letting me know.
Did I say FaceTech?
Yeah, you did. You said FaceTech.
Awesome.
Well, I have a couple thoughts there too. COVID really pushed facial authentication into overdrive. Nobody wanted to touch anything, right? So we needed to use our faces. But really, passwords and account security have been a problem for a while, right? We got so many things we have to sign into now, and passwords are just problematic. I actually moderated a PrivSec panel just last week called Digital Identity, Will We Ever See a World Without Passwords? And we didn't really come to any great conclusions in that panel, but it's very obvious that we have to move beyond passwords, or at least we have to minimize those passwords that people do manage, because passwords just aren't cutting the mustard. But are we moving too fast? Are we breaking things in the wrong way with our biometric data, personal data that we cannot change? Should we be using our faces for authentication? I've been asking that question to a lot of privacy professionals over the past week. In fact, I ran a panel, a poll on the International Association of Privacy Professionals group on LinkedIn, and a lot of people said we should be concerned. So we brought 4 excellent panelists to sort of explore different dimensions of this issue. We've got Ryan Carrier here from 𝗏𝗏 to speak about the regulation of biometric data. We've got Matthew Rosenquist, the CISO from 𝗀𝗫𝗄𝗃, to cover the security aspects of biometric data. We've got Jay Meyer from FaceTech to speak about how liveness detection can mitigate risk. And we've got Dave Burnett from Infinity Optic Solutions to consider ways to authenticate your face without storing biometric data. I think we have to pull Dave in from the audience here. So I want to start though with Ryan.
Which Dave is that, Jeff? I have a number here.
It should be Dave Burnett.
Okay, got it. Okay, yeah, got it. Okay.
Awesome. So let's start off with Ryan though, while we're getting Dave on board. Ryan, what's going on with the regulation of biometric data? Is it okay for companies to collect, to store, to process, and even sell our face data today?
Depends on where you are, where you sit, how far in advance of, and of course, as we start, my lawn crew comes, of course. Sorry about that. So it depends on where you are and what regulations you want to meet or anticipate. So, you know, some easy ones to talk about are Texas and Illinois biometric laws that have been in place for some time with not a lot of enforcement around them. You have GDPR and its impact on privacy protection, and then of course you have the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. Number 1 on Annex 3 in their list of 9 high-risk AIs is biometric identifications of natural persons. So depending on where you're at with wanting to and choosing to comply with those laws, building your compliance and process, those are responsibilities, accountabilities, and governance that you need, but enforcement remains light in most cases. And that's one of the reasons that 𝗏𝗵𝗫 advocates for independent audit of AI systems, or AI, algorithmic, and autonomous systems, is to create governance, oversight, and accountability, and a higher degree of assurance of compliance with the criteria that best protects humans. That's the 𝗏𝗵𝗫 aspect of who we are, and creates an infrastructure of trust so that it's not just companies saying, here's what we do, trust us. It's creating a third-party authentication or governance and oversight process that says, you know what these rules are, these transparent rules, these laws applied, we will go in and verify that they're being met and achieved. And so that combination, we believe, provides the best sort of, it's a combination of enforcement, but willful compliance, governance, and oversight that creates an infrastructure of trust around these technologies, which remain concerning to people. You know, the gentlemen on the screen here are leaders in each of the fields. But I would argue if you're doing facial recognition, you actually need to do what all 3 of them are bringing together, and then probably some other things to ensure or get the highest level of trust in the use of these technologies. And the last thing that I'll leave kind of for the other panelists to sort of pick at is, I believe that one of the reasons, Jeff, you kind of mentioned this fast adoption of facial recognition. One of the reasons this has happened is a massive imbalance between companies and users. Companies are reaping all of the benefits, and users are taking all of the risk. And when I say risk, it gets back to your point about the immutable nature of if their biometrics are lost. That's not to say that any one of the 3 gentlemen and their firms have these issues or problems. We'll talk about that. But the point is, generically speaking, when we talk about use of biometric data, the users are taking all the risk because of the immutable nature and the fact that there's limited disclosure, there's no residual risks, and quite frankly, we have things like algorithmic bias creating a huge problem of the ability to recognize certain faces over others. So let me leave it at that and hand back to you.
Thanks for that, Ryan. And I think, you know, I know that people are going to want to sort of address some of the things that you've raised here. And I want to give people the opportunity to do that. But I want to first sort of give everybody a chance to sort of address some base questions that I'm going to pose to each of you. And then we'll sort of get back around and we can sort of have at all of these issues. But let's next move to Matthew. Matt, can we keep this face data that companies are collecting? Can we keep it safe once we've collected it? It certainly depends upon the vendor in the system, right? And I know that many vendors are taking inordinate care with this data to encrypt it and to shard it out, to do all kinds of things to make their system what they think is as safe as possible. But this is extremely personal data, as we just, you know, Ryan just told us. What do you think about that topic? Tell us your thoughts.
Well, we need to be pragmatic and we need to be realistic. There is no data security that is perfect. It doesn't matter if it's biometric data or anything else, right? If data is being used or collected, it's potentially vulnerable. Now, that said, there are great practices out there in being able to protect data to a certain level, to a reasonable level. And so when we look at biometric or any other data, we have to take that into account. And for biometrics, let's look at facial scans or iris scans, retina scans. There's over 20 different types of biometrics data that's currently being used for authentication now in the industry. It isn't necessarily a picture of your face that gets stored. It's a digital representation, similar to like a hash, right? So it may not be just your face. It may be a similarity, a representation that can adjust, because some days you may be smiling, other days you may have shaved your beard. And so a lot of the AI systems that are coming into play take that into account. So it is that representation that needs to be secure. And there are some great best practices. So for example, on phones, right? Apple, for example, when they're capturing your biometric data, they're actually storing it in hardware on your personal device. And when it's being used to authenticate something, that data never leaves the device. In fact, it never even goes outside that side chip into your main processor of your phone. And so practices like that are considered the best in the industry. We can go to the other end of the industry where people, or services are taking your images and storing it out on some cloud out there, third-party cloud. That tends to be the worst, right? But the reality is it's a matter of finding a balance. There is no perfect security. All data can be exposed if it's ever being used. And we have to understand that as part of the pros and cons of using biometrics, which is largely convenience. And that's just part of the system that we have to accept. Anybody that tells you, no, your data is perfectly secure is either ignorant or is trying to sell you something. So it's just part of the equation.
All right, and I've got a lot of questions about what that level of risk is. But let's move on for a second and move to give Jay a chance to talk, because I know he's got a lot to say. Jay, identity theft is a major concern, right? So if this data was to get stolen, right? One of the concerns is identity theft of that biometric data. If somebody steals my face, they could become me. How does FaceTech prevent that? I know that liveness detection is pretty amazing, and you're a leader in that with that technology. Tell us about that.
Well, it's a great question, and at FaceTech, we've designed our technology so that this, with privacy by design, as people say, right? Our systems are designed such that the face biometric data can't really leave a third party. A vendor can't use the data outside of the FaceTech system. FaceTech never touches any of the biometric data. Our software is embedded in a service provider's app and then also in their server behind their firewall. And as Matthew pointed out, we believe that we are using best practices in our encryption of the data. I like to say that we trust encryption to secure data as it's at rest and in motion, and biometric data is data. So if the encryption is good enough for other data, it can secure biometric data equally well. But that's really not how our brains work here at FaceTech. We believe that really the answer to this question is to make the biometric data unusable, okay, except in the context that it was originally set up. So the thing that's unique about face biometrics is that you can capture liveness data and matching data concurrently from the same data flow, okay? Once you secure the sensor and you secure the data feed from the sensor using encryption, and we send what's called a face scan to a server behind a company's firewall where it's decrypted, and then the first thing we do is check for liveness, okay? And our liveness is very powerful. We have very many measurements that we use, but they're all passive measurements. so they can't be mimicked because people are guessing what we are measuring. Then, assuming the liveness is confirmed, we delete liveness data, okay? And remember that the data was, I like to say, it's wound together. The liveness and the matching data are coming from the same data flow. So when and what remains is called a face map, right? Which is a three-dimensional representation of this person's face, and presumably it's bound to an identity profile. And then we can authenticate against that later. But in order to submit the data to the system, you have to have the liveness and the matching data wound together as our systems require it, right? It has to be time-stamped. We do it 6 ways from Sunday, and there's a lot of other things that we do to make sure that the data hasn't been corrupted. Well, if the liveness data is required in order to resubmit the data, and we delete that liveness data, it really can't be reconstituted in a way that the system will accept it. So even if somebody does break into the database and the host company is using poor encryption or poor security practices, even if they can steal those 3D face maps, the 3D face maps can't be used to resubmit to the system, right? It will be rejected immediately. And so we think that we've rendered that data useless, and so we don't believe that there's a real issue inside of our infrastructure. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's interesting.
And we actually advocate that all face vendors do this, right? I mean, it eliminates the incentive for somebody to try and steal that data. If they can't gain access to anything with the face map, they require a face scan in order to gain access to something. Liveness has to be proven. If it's not proven, then the transaction is eliminated. But if it is proven, the face map is what's matched at a very high accuracy rate. And if you need the face scan in order to resubmit, the face map is effectively useless. And so we don't believe we have that kind of risk. Make sense?
Yeah. I think I've got a few questions, but let's give Dave a chance to talk first, and then we'll come back and I imagine there's questions on all sides. I've got questions for all 4 of you, and Dave hasn't even said anything yet. Dave, Infinity claims to have some new technology that can authenticate faces without actually even storing faces at all. Can you tell us how that's possible? Sorry, you're muted, Dave.
Yeah,
but that might be a good way to keep from storing voice.
Yeah, exactly. So all of the panelists have done a great job, I think, of describing the way that biometric systems work today, and the risks and the challenges and the mitigation effects, the mitigation strategies that you can use. And absolutely, biometric data is a type of data that requires protection. But we've approached the problem from a different perspective, using more recent innovation in mathematics, zero-knowledge proofs, and a variety of other proprietary innovation that we've put in place. And we don't actually store, whether you call them face templates or whether you call them face maps, we don't store any information about what your face looks like when we register a face for enrollment. So there is no biometric data at all. It's a formula that essentially describes your face and the result of what that formula looks like, or it's the result of what that formula plus your face looks like in a mathematical equation. And then if I take my formula and apply it to your face, Jeff, I get a very, very different result. So we're not actually doing comparisons between two templates, that have their own, whether it's vector-based data or point maps or whatever you have. We're actually computing a hash based off of a real true biometric hash based off of your face using specific formulas and where we think there are interesting features. Not what those features are, but where they are. And then when we go and verify, we generate a hash, and if it's an exact character match for the original hash, then we have a match. It's a very, very different approach. And it's very true. As long as you have sensitive data, you have to protect it. We like to take the approach of saying, well, the best template is no template, right? It's when there's no biometric information. And there's some other benefits too, because we generate a hash. We can use that hash to generate key operations where you're encrypting and decrypting other information based off of your face. So it's a very different approach that upends, in many ways, the traditional trade-offs that we've had around biometrics and security and convenience.
Really interesting. Right. Chris, you've been sitting here thinking and looking like you've got a lot of questions. Do you want to pose a question to one of our panelists?
Well, my default position is always the same. If you can avoid recording any data, you shouldn't record data at all, right? So all data in your database by default, and default is a very important thing, should be considered toxic data, right? And so from that perspective, you only have to ask yourself how much more information you attach to that, because it's pretty trivial to de-anonymize anything that is more than just 3 data points at this point in time. But yeah, so our show is called Your Bytes, Your Rights. My point is also that whatever bytes I'm creating or whatever other bytes people are creating that are using my biometrics belong to me, right? I have property rights to that, and I should get complete control over that. And to the extent that anybody can use that, all legal measures are available to me, right? So as in, if there's any type of surveillance going on using this particular data, then anybody involved with creating that particular record is actually liable from my perspective. But so our standard is just way higher, and I'm looking actually to actively invalidate any solution that doesn't respect that, right? Because the overall problem that I see is, from a global perspective, is most people on the call probably have the luxury of being able to speak out, and that's the exception to the rule around the globe. And so to the extent that we are creating these technologies, we are responsible and liable for those, even though we don't intend these particular use cases that other countries are going to do. So that was more my usual rant than really a question. But to the extent that they are private rights, and I think there might be a question for Matthew, otherwise whoever has an answer to that, remind everybody, are there any private rights, thus far private rights to actions, that is, in regards to your biometric data?
Well, there are privacy laws, right? And
right.
in the U.S., we've got a couple of states that are at the forefront there. And as Ryan indicated, Ryan really probably should be answering this question.
Yeah, okay.
There's very little enforcement, although there have been lawsuits indicating the companies have gathered biometric information, employers have gathered biometric information in violation of those laws. When we look around the world, we're seeing more and more regulations starting to focus in those areas, because again, your biometric data is very personal because it can uniquely identify you. And the reality is, it doesn't matter if it's a picture, if it's a face map, or if it's a hash of a picture or face match. It still is a unique identifier. Mm-hmm. So we can argue semantics here, but privacy is about making sure that unique identifiers, right? You, your actions, whoever you are, cannot be uniquely identified. That's one of the fundamental tenets of the privacy. We're all talking the same thing here. So we shouldn't be splitting hairs. The reality is, if you're using biometric data, you are gathering and or processing, storing, or transmitting in some way, shape, or form unique data that can be used to identify an individual.
Yeah, I think.
Ryan, did you want to jump in regards to the regulations?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Come on, Ryan.
So no, happy to, and completely agree. Matthew's got it sort of square on the head. When we think about this data, one of the first things that I loved, that I heard from most of you, and that I'd like to see happen a heck of a lot more, is there should be no sale of these data. Data should not be part of your business model in any way, shape, or form. Because when it deals with biometrics, as Chris pointed out, there is no, you have not provided me any benefit, and I don't think you're claiming this, so that's a cool start, right? But there are others who are scraping and grabbing and pulling from Facebook and pulling from video sources and creating data on me and my picture and my video. That is not okay, and it should be flat prohibited. If you have a need for my facial data, my biometric data, it should be something that I consent to because it's obviously beneficial to me. And if it's not, it should be prohibited, full stop. And so this is where the law has fallen short. We have privacy data, we have special category data under GDPR, we have sensitive personal data. Biometrics actually needs to be elevated above that. And we've done that a little bit with BIPA in Illinois, done that a little bit with Texas, but in those two places, that's where I would sort of say enforcement has fallen over. And then I want to tie this into one of the other questions that sort of talked about. I believe what each of these gentlemen are saying about how their technology works, but it would be better if it was independently audited and verified that they're doing these things. I'll give you an example. I don't believe that the WhatsApp encryption from Meta doesn't have a backdoor to Facebook. I don't mind saying that here in public. Others have tested that, okay? So they can claim encryption end-to-end at rest, but I think that it's actually being breached internally. And so now what you want, what I hope these firms would want, because I believe they're representing the highest standards of privacy, is independent verification of the things that they claim that they do. And it will make their services more powerful and more well-governed, right? And so you get those benefits. And one of the questions that was asked was, well, how does a FaceTech who has great liveness testing capability, we don't test their capability. Independent audits don't go in and go, oh, let me see how this works. Intellectual property has been governed under independent audit for 50 plus years when an auditor interfaces with the auditee, the client. So there is plenty of room. It's actually the most robust way to protect corporate intellectual property, because you can govern an independent auditor through NDA in terms of the intellectual property that you might share with them in terms of meeting compliance standards. And so it's better than, let's say, government intervention that might say, we need transparency. Hello, you don't have any recourse then. That's when we see a hindrance in innovation, because the intellectual property is getting disclosed every way from Sunday. So independent audit is actually sort of the highest form of protection for that. But one of the questions I want to sort of give to these three guys, because I think it's going to actually enhance their value, we're moving to a model of residual risk disclosure. And so when it comes to your approaches, do you have the ability to meet what we would call an FDA-esque disclosure? And most of you have probably seen these commercials, right? The drug commercials that come out, it's a happy family running through a valley with blue skies and the mountains are in the background, and the first 30 seconds say, here's what this drug will do for you, take it. But what are the second 30 seconds? Residual risk disclosures. Dryness in the mouth, in redness at the injection site, diarrhea, death, whatever the residual risks might be. We're moving to that disclosure so that when people are interfacing with your systems, they know your false positives, your false negatives, where your accommodations need to come in for accessibility and inclusion. And so I wonder how you feel about sort of that challenge and that approach to sort of risk management and dealing with, there are no perfect systems. Matthew kind of highlighted this before, right? We're never going to get perfect protection for any of this data. Well, we're also not going to get perfect applications of your systems, which is what we saw with facial recognition, right? Work 95% accuracy, unless you were a woman of color, and then it's like 40%, right? So where are these risks from using your system? And I'll just leave that for you all to chew on.
Well, right. I just want to jump in here. I agree with everything you said, with the exception of one thing, right? auditing is important, and it can give you great proactive insights. However, it isn't the high water mark. In my mind, the high water mark is when it's out in the field and the bad guys are pounding on it and attacking it and undermining it.
Right.
That is the true test.
Right.
And I've been working for 20 years. I've been in the security industry for over 30, but for 20 years, I've been working with biometric companies, hardware, firmware, software, applications, cloud, you name it, and poking holes and saying, I know you think you've got the greatest thing since sliced bread, but the reality is these are the 10 ways you're going to get owned. Yes. Right? And I haven't even looked at your code.
Yeah.
So,
and then on top of that, there's a difference between how your core technology could be compromised and then how it's deployed by a customer.
Yep. And all the dependencies you have, not only in your code, but also the service dependencies of, you're connecting to the phone or you're connecting to some other operating system, and then layer on the end user. I mean, come on.
And the humans and the humans in the loop.
Place
Absolutely.
to hack.
Yeah.
If I could make a comment on this, please. We are strong advocates of independent third-party validation, right, including safety audits, and we are strong advocates of best practices, including full risk disclosures. And in fact, I've done a lot of work with a number of the identity framework that are starting to emerge out there. And one of the things that we've worked on was best practices, and the idea of voluntary versus involuntary enrollment and educating the consumer. I absolutely believe that everybody needs to be educated, and the industry just gave a speech last week that said we need to do a better job educating people, because it's the fear mongering that is really holding this industry back. Okay, there's a lot of things that are said today that are just patently false about face biometrics, and it's sometimes political, sometimes it's just ignorant. I want to point out, though, one thing at FaceTech. We have a program that we call Spoof Bounty. Okay, we are the only biometric vendor on the planet that we are aware of that has stood up a Spoof Bounty program. And we've had this bounty program in place for over 2 years, and we've had something like 140,000 attempts to breach our technology. We've actually been breached a couple times, and if somebody does find a way through it to break through our liveness and et cetera, we pay a bounty, right? And so we openly invite people to try and demonstrate to us where our vulnerabilities are. And of course, it's the best R&D money we can buy, because the bad guys are extremely resourceful, right? So we're able to close those vulnerabilities, and we haven't had a breach in almost 2 years. We've only paid out twice. And so, you can go check it out at www.spoofbounty.com, our shameless plug. But, we put our money where our mouth is. And I would ask all of the vendors in the space to do something just like that.
Bug bounties are a great program. By the way, lots of other companies do it. Apple does it. They go through typically other specific hacker bug bounty programs like HackerOne and so forth. So there's lots of companies out there that are doing that. And that is absolutely industry best practice. In addition to doing independent red team testing, that also can find a huge amount of holes. Huge. So it's all best practice.
Yeah. There's a significant difference when you assume that your systems will get breached or will be deployed incorrectly, and that attackers will be going at it. And I cannot tell you how many customers I've worked at, either in face or fingerprint or iris authentication, where the customers got a hold of the technology and just did incredibly insecure things with the technology, which is part of why, at Infinity we've really tried to upend the equation. And we can have all sorts of discussions about the security and the safety of our particular approach, but we've really tried to assume that the customer is going to do bad things and the data will leak out of the system, and then what's the potential damage of the data that would be most likely leaked. And that's why we've taken the approach of getting rid of all that biometric data out of our authentication codes, we call them, so that, and there's no personally identifying information in them as well. So even if they're leaked, they're of little value because you don't know necessarily who they were connected to. And then on top of that, we have some other interesting things that we can do, like getting back to some consent issues, right? We can actually record inside of our authentication codes the date and time that consent was given for this to be collected. So trying to address multiple problems in this space, as well as watermarking them so that they can only be used by one company and not another. So you can't take one and then go to another company that's using our zero face technology and then inject that authentication code into another party that happens to be using the same tech.
Yeah, I think you can summarize it under one kind of headline. So rather than the old Google adage of "don't be evil," can't be evil, right? You need to design your systems and your software solutions, including your decentralized software solutions, in a way that they cannot be used for evil, so that they can't be evil. But then also someone in the audience just kind of added to that. There was a recent court order that a company actually had to delete their algorithm specifically. And the person didn't allude to that, I think, but kind of mentioned like, what do you do about algorithms? And I think we're going to see more of that, to where courts will recognize, well, it's not just the data, it's also the algorithms that you created using this particular data. And I don't remember for sure in that $650 million Facebook settlement with BYBR and Illinois, whether or not they were required to delete the algorithm, but I don't think so. Anybody
It's
knows
also the
that?
training data too. So the algorithm is absolutely important, but also the training data
Right.
for machine learning and deep learning systems. That also plays a tremendous role.
Yes.
If that's how you work, we actually don't. We don't rely upon AI and deep network training whatsoever. So
There's actually a new BYBR case. I think it was just filed this week, where somebody is claiming that Microsoft and I think maybe another company as well used Flickr data, face data from Flickr to create their facial recognition algorithms, and is essentially taking them to task for that. And if it's proven,
there's a whole dark history about that, by the way. So I actually managed Intel's AI group, the security for AI and their products and everything else. So, and back in the day, those training sets were simply academics going out there, literally scraping Facebook and everything else, and throwing it out there. And once you had momentum, once 10 groups or companies used it, it became a standard. So everybody had to use that to test against what was the big boys were using. So it became a self-reinforcing practice that completely unethical. And unfortunately, that's where a lot of products are, and the lawsuits are now coming around as predicted.
And I wanted to pick up on sort of ideas that Jay and Dave were putting forward, which is the EU Artificial Intelligence Act is leading the way in terms of the way that providers need to interface with users. So they use the word users. Unfortunately, it's a terrible use of the word, and maybe it'll get changed in the amendments. But users means technical users all the way down to natural persons. And unfortunately, we need that distinction between the two, because technical users are meant to be trained, and in a deep way, with a concerted effort to recognize that providers will have liability if they insufficiently train users. And users will have liability if they insufficiently receive compliance criteria that are necessary to comply with the Act. And so the nature of that process improves who is responsible for what and to whom in the process. That will provide improved clarity, and to their point, that will improve the nature of, well, I've taken your system, but now I've used it poorly. Well, now you'll be in a better place to kind of say, as providers, got to be done like this, like this, like this. And if you don't, you're creating this problem, that problem, and so on, and thus the residual risk disclosures as well. So we're beginning to get to that. And one of the other innovations that I like, and it kind of plays on Dave's line of thinking, is that California allows for short-term and transient usage. So it's a new description of data that actually allows you to be only session-oriented, and it's very privacy preserving because essentially you can have retention rules around the data. It says session done, data done, right? And that will improve the ability of a natural person to interface with a lot of places where they can operate with short-term and transient data. Now we can say things like you should, or maybe you shall.
Or must, right?
Shall, must, yes, yeah.
Yes, we've actually encoded the ability to put an expiration date in our authentication codes. So when you allow someone to collect your data, you can say, well, you can have my face, my authentication code for my face, you can have it for 1 day or 3 days or for 30 days. And then after that, the system will treat it as invalid data. And that's all hard coded, it's below the hood. It's not something that a uninformed developer could work their way around. But it's getting...
Could you encode deletion and destruction, where there are actually distinctions between those two? We can talk about that in another place, but that would be, to me, even a better practice, right? It hits its use by date, it's done, it goes away.
Yep, exactly.
And data retention and data destruction are, again, best practices. Having those documented and putting in the structures in the code, right, for automation, great. However, we are seeing many companies, big companies, that this is their business. They find workarounds, and workarounds really aren't that difficult. So, for example, I capture Ryan's data because he wants to log into his social media account and say, hey, I'm going to delete it right after you log in. Yeah, I am. I'm not going to delete the hash of it. I'm going to create a unique identifier based on his biometric so I can track him. Guess what? I don't have your biometric data, but I've now derived a unique identifier that I can match again and again and sell to others who can match it, which means we can all track him. And so no, there are always counter steps, and we're talking about billions, hundreds of billions of dollars here. Companies don't walk away from that quickly. And so yes, we can create privacy laws, but they will always be one step behind the innovativeness of the companies whose revenues depend on this, unless we take sweeping action.
I completely agree, right? And to make kind of expand on your point, when I connect to my bank website, even before I authenticate, they are like 98% confident that they know who I am, right? Without any form of biometric authentication happening, right? Because of all of the device fingerprinting and cookies and all of that kind of stuff. And they almost don't even need to authenticate, but there are all sorts of reasons why they do it. But there is a difference between what they can do or what they are already doing with non-biometric data to quote unquote fingerprint you, and whether the systems that they deploy will allow them to actually do that face of verification of you beyond the permissions that you give them at the time that you enroll. And I think that's where we have to move to as an industry, which is, in going back to something that was said earlier, that really our biometrics need to be ours, and instead of our biometrics being taken from us at enrollment, that we need to generate our own biometrics and then give them to providers, service providers, and in that grant to them, we have to embed. You're the only person that can use this authentication code. And you can only use it for this amount of time. And if you don't delete it, I'm going to get a message from your system telling me that you didn't actually delete it, even though it's not going to work beyond a certain amount of time, unless you hack the core tech. And that's all stuff that we've designed into our stack at Infinity.
Go ahead, Jay.
I'd love to chime in on this. I mean, I agree with everything that everybody said. At the center of all of this is citizen consumer control of their biometric data, right? Yeah. And also trust in the capabilities of these systems, right? So one of the issues, the reality is that face biometrics are not going away. In fact, they are going to be used more and more and more. Okay, there's a lot of reasons for that, which I can describe, and I will talk for days on that kind of thing. But the fact that passports require face data on the document and in the chip is one example of why this isn't going away anytime soon, right? And you can look at some of the treaties that are being signed in the EU, for example, where countries are now sharing face data with each other for immigration control related things, right? So that raises the question of how much control can a citizen actually have over their biometric data. Well, one of the things that we did, and we are advocating this with the ISO technical advisory groups on mobile driver's licenses and with 𝗵𝗂𝗶𝗴, the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, which manages the standards for driver's licenses. Our driver's licenses all have our picture on there, right? There is a photo of our face bound to an identity profile at the state DMV, right? So what we actually recommend and are advocating out there is we think that data is verified. Okay, what's at the DMV is verified as that this is really 𝗀𝗰𝗄𝗃. This is Jay, his driver's license data, and this is his face, right? So we advocate authenticating to that, right, or verifying to that. When someone tries to enroll at a bank, for example. But rather than giving the bank control of the biometric data, why don't we give the consumer control of the data, right, in the form of an API token, right? So, we have an app on the phone, an MDL app that will have tokens that validate that the mobile driver's license on the phone is real, right? And we know by default that data is verified. It's encrypted, it can't be altered, we believe it's safe. And the consumer has the right to pass certain information to a relying party like a bank. Well, we can do the same thing with biometrics, okay? Apple does it, on their phones in a way. They pass a token that says this face matches the one that's stored in the phone. It doesn't say anything about whether or not it's your face or whose face it is, which is a problem. Anonymous biometrics are a weakness of those systems, right? But instead, we could match behind the firewall at the DMV, and the DMV can send a token back to the wallet that the consumer controls. It can be time-stamped, and it can say, yes, this face that Jay just sent matches the stored value at the DMV, and this was done within 30 seconds, right? And then I would have the opportunity to pass that to the bank, and the bank can know with a much higher level of confidence that it is actually Jay holding that device, right? And it's the same guy that was represented by the MDL, and it's the same face that's stored with the MDL. And we think that gives the consumer control and assures their privacy. There's no phone home issue. The government can't track where you pass that token, right? They have no idea what you're doing with it. So the consumer can't be followed around, and they control who they give that token to. Make sense?
Yeah, I like that, the wallet model.
So again, in the industry, there are best practices. Anytime you are transmitting actual biometric data, it's really actually not best practice. So tokenization, absolutely, right? And again, I go back to Apple, although I don't even use Apple, right? I use Android phones, but when you register your face to unlock your Apple device, it stores it in a separate chip on the device. And when a third-party app says, hey, I want to know if this is Matthew, scan your face, it is that chip that's basically getting the data from your face. It checks the records on that chip, and if it matches, it doesn't send the biometric data. It sends basically an encrypted token, right? A digital signature. And that's all the third party gets, is a signature, basically a certificate that says, hey, we checked it, and it matches this person. But if biometric data, someone's face actually is getting transmitted, that is not best practice. You can intercept
There's
it
a problem
transit,
in
you
this.
can intercept it at storage, and you can intercept it in use, right? So that's not best practice. And I would advocate, there are many models that do that can support, best practice.
That makes a lot of sense, but I would point out that the biometric data that is stored in the secure element on the phone, it doesn't matter what phone it is, okay, it's not associated with an identity, a verified identity anywhere. Okay.
You absolutely can. There's identity services that do this. Employers do this as well, but it's a part of the provisioning. It's part of the provisioning.
So the provisioning, so provisioning that biometric data to a device of some type, if it's not supervised, you cannot know for certain that it is actually the owner of the phone and the owner of the privilege who is enrolled on the phone. So today with MDLs, for example, you have to provision at the DMV, right? And the verification, the authentication transaction is a supervised transaction as well. It really it doesn't have a method of authenticating anybody. And the reason the standard doesn't have that is because they haven't figured out how to do that yet, right? There's iteration 7, which who knows when that's going to come out, okay? 5 came out and it only deals with the data on the device, on the document. Well, there's this thing called the PKI fallacy that says that if there's this idea that if we can encrypt the device and we can encrypt the data on the device, that somehow tells us who's actually holding the device, okay? The problem with anonymous biometrics is that we have no idea who is actually holding the device. We just know that the face that was scanned a moment ago matches the data that's stored in the secure element. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not saying that that's,
it's one piece of a very important puzzle. Yes.
But if you look at the fingerprint modules in those systems, they take up to 5 fingers. Not only do they not know whose hand they came from, but they can't even tell if they came from the same hand, right? Which opens up other vulnerabilities. So, in between now and sometime in the future, we have to be able to verify who these people are when they are trying to apply for privileges online in an unsupervised environment. And what happens on the phones simply is it's a security preference level, right? The higher the value of the transaction or the asset that you're trying to protect, the more security you would require. So, buying coffee online for a couple bucks might not be important, right? Might not be very valuable. So maybe the anonymous biometrics with the PKI fallacy is good enough. But opening a bank account, and I would argue that if you know anything about money laundering statistics in the United States, the banks have no idea who is controlling these accounts, okay? I laugh every time I hear somebody say, the banks know 98% confident they know who's using it. They have no idea who's using it.
PKI and
$1.5 trillion in money laundering.
Bank. So they've got decent confidence, and they use government-issued documents primarily.
Yeah, so when you go online, great, they're forged, and when you go online and you try and use the app, how does the bank know that it's actually you using the app?
Because
how does the bank know?
Right, secure provision, yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many interesting challenges and problems here, right? And I've been in this space, like many of the other panelists, I've been in this space for a long time. I've been involved with mobile phone design, with fingerprint sensors, iris systems, face systems, and no matter what happens, no matter what innovation, whether it's my company, Infinity, whether it's Face Tech, it doesn't, we can bring a lot of innovation to bear, but as long as the core piece of the system relies upon computed biometric information, right, and it's reversible, or you can look at it and use it to hack, right, that will remain, that adds to the overall solution design complexity, because then you not only have to worry about, well, did I do a good binding between what I think is this person and some identity representation? You have to worry about the risk of the biometric system itself being breached. And it's, this isn't, I can't go into enough detail about it here because this is a group discussion, but it's a radically different equation when you take away the biometric sensitivity, when you're doing your authentication with no personally identifying information involved at all. Because then a whole piece of this discussion of, well, how do we protect, our templates? That just goes away. It's a very, and then sure, there are plenty of other solution issues and integration, and how do you know that this really is the person? How do you know it's not a fake driver's license that they scanned? Are you calling back to the DMV services and having them do a piece of it? And what credentials? All of those things are. There's so many challenges in making it work safely. Forget for a moment whether you're really empowering the user to control their own data or not, which is a whole different problem in this. And I think what we will see across the industry is that more and more companies that are in the biometric space are going to have to move to zero knowledge proof-based solutions, because it really radically changes the design architecture on a mobile phone or on a bank. Yes, completely agree. You can't copy today's templates from device to device safely, but when there is no biometric information and it's non-identifying in its core nature, an authentication code can be copied from device to device. So lots of layers to all of this, but it's I think this has just been a fantastic discussion across the panel.
Yeah,
we all clearly know this space very well.
Yeah, we're all saying kind of the same thing. Yeah. Well,
we talked about that from the beginning. No perfect solution. It's all a matter of finding that right layer.
Well,
biometrics is great as a part of a multi-factor, authentication system, right? It's a great factor. It's not the entire solution. It's a great factor to it.
Yeah.
And that's what we see in the industry.
Yeah, Matthew, I think what's important for everybody to understand, and there are specifically regulators and people are in a position to make broader changes, is that we really need to work on the topology of what we call networks and the internet and World Wide Web today, right? So the initial sin was not really introducing advertising into the system. The original sin was that we designed a system that's basically a push system that basically deals with database systems that allow other entities control over my agency, because we're all talking about privacy and data, but that's not what we are really concerned about, right? So these are just the technologies and externalities that other entities are using to influence us. So ultimately it's always about human agency and self-determination, and obviously we know which countries are using this for bad, right? So for obvious purposes, like finding people and shaming people when they're jaywalking, and that's absurd, right? That we already see these things in the world, and I don't ever want to see this in the world. But honestly, I think we kind of already passed this Rubicon, to the extent that the bad actors that want to use these technologies for bad have their hands on it, and at least half of our biometric data of citizens in the US is in databases, and once it's in a database, everybody has it, right? So just assume that everybody has a copy of that at this point in time. So now it's really almost at the point where we need to do damage mitigation. That doesn't mean that we don't need to design systems that don't redo the violations of the past, but that also means that we need to design systems that go after those violators and protect mostly the innocent, because again, we are maybe inundated by useless things in advertising, but other people are actually having their livelihood taken from them, right? Because originally a lot of these systems, I think going back to the 90s and maybe earlier, and Jay can probably talk to that, were designed specifically to monitor prison inmates, right, by DARPA. And if you think about this, that we kind of took this technology and let it out in the wild to then monitor anybody, right? So Walmart is testing that to see what if people are frowning or happy or confused when they walk through the aisles to adjust their format, right? And then another anecdote is a man was falsely accused of robbing a bank based on some facial recognition software, and he basically lost his wife, lost his job, lost his house, fighting that result. Ultimately, the court ruled in his favor, but it took him all the steps to go through because of this technology. And that, again, this is just one example and one anecdote. The ultimate thing is always the same, as in when I saw the Bitcoin white paper, when we were looking for technologies to decentralize the web, what I recognized is that this technology allows you for the first time to own your own bytes. That's what this is about, right? You should have ownership, control, possession over all your digital dust. And that's why we're doing these talks every Friday. And I love the fact that we finally have an audience for that, and finally also have an interdisciplinary discourse, because the leader is, I think, what's mostly missing. Right? And I have this, I'm sure you guys too, but we have this discussion on a daily basis, and here as a fund, we are looking at solutions in this space on a daily basis. And for us, and that's a call to action, everybody out there, it's part of our due diligence check. It's like, how do you treat this information? How do you treat the user? Are you actually treating it in the same way that you would if this person is standing in front of you? Or not? And if not, you go into our bad bucket, as in, we'll find you later and invalidate your particular business model later. And to me, this is, again, it's black and white. It's no longer about can't be evil. It's entirely about, it's no longer about won't be evil. And as far as I'm concerned, Google is the most evil company, setting Facebook aside, that's out there. And the way it's doing information distribution, we need to insist as humans, as a society, that technology cannot be evil, right? Because people will be evil, but you can bet on that. So we need to insist that our technology cannot be evil. Last words from Jeff.
Since evil, right? It isn't good or evil. It depends on how it's used. How technology manifests. I can build the most perfect hammer for you to build homeless shelters.
Yeah,
somebody can take it and bash in their neighbor's head.
Yes.
Technology is simply a tool.
You're using my example. I use that example almost every week.
I don't know anything about anyone's background. Okay, I don't know.
Yeah. No, but actually, it's in this particular case, it's about not particular technology, but technology in general. Technology. So if you can design technology so that can't be evil, right? So my robot cannot kill me, so to speak. That's your obligation, right? Then it's no longer part of a function. That is just an obligation. It's a difference when you know that specifically about negative rights and positive rights, right? Yeah. Anyway, we're at the top of the hour, so I'll let Jeff do the outro here, and I'll blend in.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So this was a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate all of our guests here. One thing to add quickly, I thought this was interesting that, we started off talking about facial authentication, and we ended up talking about identity, which I think is, a core concept that we have to solve, as Chris sort of started to get to there. And I'll leave it at that since we're over time. But I want to thank again Ryan Carrier from For Humanity, and Matthew Rosenquist from 𝗵𝗵𝗄𝗃.io, and Jay Meyer from FaceTech, and Dave Brunette from Infinity Optics. So it's been a wonderful conversation. Hope everyone has a great weekend, and catch us back here next week for another episode of Your Bytes, Your Rights. Have a great weekend.